The Villisca Axe Murders, Iowa, 1912. In the small town of Villisca, Iowa, 1912, the night was warm, calm, and quiet. Families slept with their windows open, the hum of summer insects drifting through the air. But in one white, wooden house on East 2nd Street, a darkness was waiting. By dawn, 8 people would be found butchered inside, 6 children and 2 adults, all slain with an axe. The crime shocked the nation, terrified small-town America, and has remained unsolved for over a century. Tonight, we step back into that house and relive the horror of the Villisca Axe Murders. Chapter 1: A Quiet Town Before the Darkness. On a summer evening in June 1912, the small town of Villisca, Iowa, sat quietly under the fading glow of twilight. It was the kind of town where everyone knew each other's names, where gossip moved faster than the mail train, and where a sense of community kept neighbors close. Villisca was small, just a few thousand people, and nestled in the rolling fields of the Midwest. It seemed to embody everything simple and safe about rural life in the early 20th century. Children ran freely in the dusty streets, their laughter carrying into the night air. Shopkeepers swept the wooden sidewalks in front of their stores. Families gathered around dinner tables, oil lamps flickering in their windows as the sun dipped below the horizon. Villisca was the type of town where doors were left unlocked, and a stranger was quickly noticed. In short, it was a place where murder felt like an impossible word, something that happened far away in lawless cities, not in their own backyard. But beneath this image of safety, Villisca was not entirely untouched by the anxieties of its time. The year 1912 was a period of great change in America. Automobiles were beginning to appear more frequently, technology was advancing rapidly, and the world itself felt like it was shifting in unfamiliar ways. For a small farming community like Villisca, these changes brought both excitement and unease. And though the town was tight-knit, it was not without tensions, religious rivalries, disputes over land, whispers of jealousy, and the natural frictions that simmer under any close community. Yet on Sunday, June 9, 1912, no one could have predicted that Villisca was about to change forever. The Moore family. At the center of this story was the Moore family. Josiah Joe Moore, the father, was a respected businessman in town. He owned a successful farm equipment business and was considered a man of good character, responsible, church-going, and well-liked. His wife, Sarah Moore, was equally admired, especially for her devotion to the local Presbyterian church where she taught Sunday school. The couple had 4 children. Herman, 11 years old, the eldest son who often helped his father. Catherine, 10, bright and playful. Boyd, just 7, mischievous but sweet-natured. Paul, the youngest at 5 years old, full of energy and innocence. By all accounts, the Moores were a picture of an upstanding Midwestern family, hardworking, close-knit, and involved in nearly every aspect of community life. The special church event. That Sunday evening was special. The local Presbyterian church was holding a Children's Day program, a festive occasion filled with songs, recitations, and performances by the town's youth. Sarah Moore had organized much of it, and her own children were participants. The Moores spent the evening at the church alongside dozens of other townsfolk, enjoying the celebration. Also present were 2 young girls from a neighboring family, Lena and Ina Stillinger, aged 12 and 8. The Stillinger sisters were close friends with the Moore children, and when the night came to an end, they were invited to spend the night at the Moore household. Their parents agreed, grateful for the hospitality, and so the 2 sisters joined the family of 6 on the short walk home. At around 9:30 p.m., the group left the church together. Neighbors saw them laughing, walking in pairs, lantern light bobbing as they strolled down the familiar road toward their white, 2-story home on East 2nd Street. Nothing seemed unusual. No one suspected that this would be the last time they were seen alive. The house at 508 East 2nd Street. The Moore house itself was modest but comfortable, with 2 stories, a parlor, kitchen, and bedrooms upstairs. That night, the family settled in like always. Oil lamps were extinguished one by one. Sarah tucked the younger children into bed. The Stillinger girls slept together in the guest room. Outside, the town grew quiet as midnight approached, only the distant whistle of a train breaking the silence. What no one in Villisca realized was that by the time the lamps were dimmed, someone else may already have been inside the house. Later investigations suggested that the killer had been waiting, hiding in the attic or perhaps lurking in the shadows outside, watching as the family prepared for sleep. Whoever it was, they carried with them an axe and an intent so dark that it would leave the entire nation horrified. The calm before horror. To imagine Villisca that night is to imagine calmness before a storm. Horses shifted lazily in barns. The scent of hay and wood smoke lingered in the warm summer air. Neighbors drifted to sleep without locking their doors, never imagining danger could come so close. And inside the Moore household, 8 innocent lives rested peacefully, unaware that death was moving closer with every passing hour. By the time dawn arrived, the Moore home would become the scene of one of the most infamous and gruesome crimes in American history. A case so brutal that more than a century later, it still captures imaginations, fuels nightmares, and remains unsolved. Chapter 2. A House Too Quiet. Morning came to Villisca, Iowa, on June 10, 1912, with the same small-town rhythm as any other Monday. The sun rose over the tidy rows of farmhouses. The smell of fresh bread drifted from kitchen windows, and neighbors began their daily routines. Yet on this particular morning, one house on the quiet street of East 2nd Avenue seemed strangely still, the white 2-story home of the Moore family. Josiah Moore, known simply as Joe to most townsfolk, was a respected businessman and an active member of the local Presbyterian church. His wife, Sarah, was equally well-liked, always welcoming guests and looking after her 4 lively children, Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul. To those who knew them, the Moores embodied the wholesome, hard-working spirit of small-town America. That is why, when their house remained uncharacteristically silent that Monday morning, concern quickly grew. The first signs of worry. The Moore children were expected at school that morning, but none arrived. Their teacher, who knew the family well, found it unusual but not immediately alarming. After all, children sometimes fell ill, or families traveled unexpectedly. But as the hours ticked by and no word came, suspicion began to creep in. Meanwhile, Mary Peckham, the Moore's next-door neighbor, noticed something unsettling. By 8 a.m., she was out hanging laundry when she realized she hadn't seen a single person leave the Moore house. The chickens in their small coop hadn't been fed, and the house's blinds remained tightly drawn. Sarah was usually up early, bustling about with chores, and the children's laughter often spilled into the yard. But today, silence reigned. By 8:30 a.m., Mary's unease grew too strong to ignore. She walked over to the Moore house and knocked firmly on the door. No answer. She tried again, louder this time. Still, nothing stirred inside. She rattled the doorknob. It was locked, which was unusual in a town where many residents rarely even bothered to secure their doors. Mary circled the house, peeking into windows, but heavy curtains blocked her view. Finally, she decided to call Joe's brother, Ross Moore, who lived nearby. Ross was known for being dependable, and Mary trusted he would know what to do. Ross Moore arrives. When Ross arrived around 8:45 a.m., he immediately sensed something was wrong. The locked door troubled him. He knocked loudly, calling out his brother's name, then Sarah's. No answer. He tried the back door. It too was locked. Ross took out his spare key and, with hesitation, unlocked the front door. Mary remained on the porch, reluctant to enter. The moment Ross stepped inside, he was struck by the heavy stillness of the air. The house, normally filled with the sounds of a bustling family, felt unnervingly quiet. The curtains were drawn tight, blocking out the morning sunlight. The smell was faint but strange, something he couldn't place right away. Ross called out again, his voice echoing through the house. No one answered. He moved cautiously through the front parlor and into the downstairs bedroom. What he found there froze him in place. On the bed lay 2 small figures, covered with a blood-stained sheet. The sight was too much to process at once. At first, Ross hoped, that it might be a terrible accident. But the dark stains on the bedding told another story. His stomach lurched, and he quickly backed out of the room. Shaken, he rushed to the porch and told Mary to call the town's marshal, Hank Horton. Ross, his face pale, refused to let her step inside. The marshal's grim discovery. Marshal Horton arrived around 9:10 a.m. By then, Word had already begun to spread through Villisca that something dreadful had happened at the Moore house. Curious onlookers started to gather outside, murmuring anxiously. Inside, Horton conducted a cautious inspection. He first entered the downstairs guest bedroom, where Ross had already peeked. There he found the lifeless bodies of the Stillinger sisters, Lena and Ina, the young guests who had stayed over after attending church with the Moores the night before. Both girls had been brutally attacked in their sleep. The sight was horrifying, but Horton pressed on. Upstairs, the scene grew even more gruesome. In the main bedroom, he found Joe and Sarah Moore. Both had been savagely bludgeoned with an axe. Joe's wounds were especially horrific, his head crushed beyond recognition. Sarah lay beside him, similarly mutilated. The brutality spoke of a rage far beyond a simple act of violence. In the children's room nearby, the 4 more children lay still in their beds, each struck down as they slept. The peaceful innocence of their faces contrasted sharply with the violence that had ended their young lives. What struck Horton most was not just the carnage, but the eerie care the killer had taken afterward. Every mirror in the house had been covered with cloth or clothing. Windows were shrouded. A slab of raw bacon was found left out in the kitchen, wrapped in a dish rag, its purpose a mystery. It was as if the killer had lingered in the house after the murders, moving calmly, almost methodically, to conceal the mirrors, as if trying to hide from his own reflection. Shock waves through Villisca. By 10 a.m., the horrifying news was out. Villisca, a close-knit town where neighbors looked out for one another, was shaken to its core. People who had just seen the Moore family alive and cheerful at church the previous day could not comprehend that they were now gone, wiped out in a single night of unimaginable violence. Crowds swelled outside the house as more residents arrived, whispering rumors and speculating about who could have committed such an atrocity. Fear spread quickly. If someone could murder an entire family so brutally and escape unnoticed, then no home in Villisca was truly safe. Some neighbors wept openly. Others spoke in hushed, fearful tones. Parents clutched their children tightly, vowing never to leave doors unlocked again. For a town of fewer than 2,500 people, this massacre wasn't just a tragedy. It was a rupture in the very sense of safety and trust that bound the community together. Marshal Horton, overwhelmed by the scale of the crime, called for the county coroner and alerted local law enforcement. But as the small town soon discovered, the gruesome case would not be simple to solve. The Villisca Axe Murders had begun their grip on history. Chapter 3, the investigation begins. The gruesome discovery at the Moore home on the morning of June 10, 1912, sent immediate shockwaves through Villisca. Within hours, the small farmhouse had become the epicenter of fear, grief, and morbid curiosity. Yet while townspeople gathered outside in stunned silence, inside the house a different atmosphere prevailed. Confusion, urgency, and the overwhelming pressure of a crime so savage it defied understanding. Chaos at the crime scene. One of the first major obstacles in the investigation emerged almost instantly. The crime scene was compromised. In modern times, we often think of police tape, forensics teams, and strict protocols to preserve evidence. But in 1912, especially in a rural Iowa town, such practices were virtually non-existent. After Marshal Hank Horton confirmed the murders, word spread quickly, and townsfolk flooded to the scene. Despite Horton's efforts to keep people out, dozens, eventually hundreds, of curious residents entered the Moore house. They filed through the rooms where the bodies still lay, whispering prayers, gasping at the horror, and in some cases, even touching objects inside. Some onlookers later admitted to picking up pieces of evidence, such as the bloody axe, before putting them back. Others claimed to have shifted objects or even tried to peek beneath the sheets covering the victims. This contamination would prove devastating. Any potential fingerprints, footprints, or other forensic clues were trampled, smudged, or destroyed. Instead of a preserved crime scene, investigators faced a chaotic, compromised house filled with both tragedy and intrusion. The axe and the odd clues. Despite the contamination, certain chilling details stood out. The murder weapon itself, a large axe, was found leaning against a wall in the guest room where the Stillinger sisters lay. It belonged to Josiah Moore, taken from the family's woodshed. Stranger still were the peculiar acts the killer had performed after the murders. Every mirror in the house had been covered with clothing or fabric. Windows were blocked with sheets or curtains. In the kitchen, investigators found a plate of uneaten food and a bowl of bloody water, as if the killer had paused for a meal and then attempted to wash up. Even more bizarre was the discovery of a slab of raw bacon wrapped in a dish towel, left on the floor near the Stillinger girls' room. Another piece of bacon was found in the icebox. The meaning behind this detail remains one of the most unsettling mysteries of the case. Was it some kind of ritual, a taunt, or merely a disturbed act of impulse? The victims, too, showed signs of unusual treatment. All were struck multiple times in the head with the blunt end of the axe, not the blade. Some had been covered with bedclothes after death, almost as if the killer wished to hide the horror of what he had done, or perhaps to erase his own guilt. First suspicions. As news spread, speculation erupted. Who could have committed such an atrocity? In a town where most people knew each other by name, the thought that one of their own might be responsible was terrifying. Yet the alternative, that a stranger had slipped into town, murdered 8 people, and vanished without a trace, was equally chilling. The first suspects naturally included those closest to the Moors. But soon, attention turned outward. Rumors swirled of strangers seen in Villisca in the days before the murders. Some spoke of a mysterious man who had been seen lingering near the Moore home on Sunday night. Others recalled a drifter spotted around the train station. Marshal Horton, overwhelmed by the enormity of the crime, sought help from outside law enforcement. Investigators from neighboring counties, and eventually the state, joined in. Yet their methods were crude by today's standards. Lacking fingerprint databases, DNA analysis, or advanced forensic tools, they relied heavily on witness testimony, local gossip, and intuition. Theories take shape. 2 primary theories began to form in those early days. The first was that the murders were the work of a deranged stranger, perhaps a transient laborer or a vagrant who had hopped off the nearby railroad. The brutality of the killings, combined with the apparent lack of motive such as robbery, suggested the work of a madman. The second theory, far more frightening to the townspeople, was that the killer was someone they knew, someone from Villisca itself. Whispers spread quickly. Could it have been a jealous neighbor, a business rival of Josiah Moore, or someone connected to the Stillinger girls who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time? One chilling possibility raised by some was that the killer had been hiding in the Moore house before the murders, waiting until the family was asleep. This theory gained traction when it was noted that all doors had been locked from the inside, suggesting the murderer had not broken in. He may have entered while the Moores were at church that evening, concealed himself in the attic or a closet, and emerged in the dead of night to carry out his attack. A town gripped by fear. The impact on Villisca was immediate and profound. Panic gripped the community. Families who had never locked their doors before now bolted them shut at night. Parents forbade their children from walking alone. Neighbors eyed one another with suspicion, wondering if the murderer lived among them. Newspapers seized on the story, amplifying the sense of terror. Headlines screamed of the Villisca Axe Murders, and reporters from across the country descended on the small town. What had once been a quiet, anonymous community was now infamous nationwide. Within days, Villisca became a place of both mourning and paranoia. The funerals of the Moore family and the Stillinger sisters drew thousands, with mourners spilling into the streets. Tears flowed freely, but so did questions. Why them? And who could possibly have done this? The beginning of a long hunt. Despite the lack of forensic sophistication, investigators were determined. They began questioning townsfolk, tracking down drifters, and piecing together timelines. Dozens of suspects would be considered in the months and years ahead, ranging from traveling preachers to local businessmen, each theory more sensational than the last. But in those early days, one truth was already clear. The murders had left scars not only on the victims' families, but on the entire town of Villisca. Fear had taken root, and it would not let go easily. The investigation was only beginning, but already it seemed destined to be a long, winding path filled with dead ends, suspicion, and haunting uncertainty. The Villisca Axe murders were no longer just a tragedy. They were becoming a mystery that would torment a community and capture the nation's imagination for more than a century. Chapter 4: Suspects and Scandals. In the aftermath of the Villisca Axe murders, grief slowly gave way to suspicion. For a crime so brutal, so intimate, there had to be someone responsible. Yet in a town where nearly everyone knew each other, pointing fingers was both dangerous and inevitable. As investigators searched for answers, suspects emerged, some based on rumor, some on circumstantial evidence, and others because of shocking revelations that would rock Villisca to its core. The stranger theory. From the very beginning, one of the most plausible explanations was that the killer was not from Villisca at all. Villisca was a railroad town, and trains passed through day and night, bringing workers, travelers, and drifters. Anyone could have stepped off, committed the crime, and disappeared before sunrise. Witnesses reported seeing a strange man loitering near the Moore home on the evening of June 9, 1912. Some claimed he carried a bag. Others thought he looked nervous, watching the family during the church event. Investigators wondered if this was the killer, waiting for the family to return home and fall asleep. Supporting this idea was the discovery of cigarette butts in the attic. Many believe the murderer had hidden there for hours, perhaps even before the Moores returned from church. If true, this was not a random act of violence, but a chillingly deliberate plan, lying in wait, watching, and striking when the house was silent. Frank Jones, the respected rival. But the idea of a faceless drifter didn't sit well with many in town. Instead, suspicion soon turned inward, to someone with both motive and opportunity. Josiah Moore had once worked for a prominent Villisca businessman named State Senator Frank Jones, who owned a thriving implement company. Josiah had been one of Jones's best employees, until a bitter falling out drove him to open his own competing business. Worse, Josiah had allegedly stolen some of Jones's biggest clients, including the lucrative John Deere account. The rivalry turned into a full-blown feud. Though never proven, whispers in Villisca suggested that Frank Jones despised Josiah, and some even claimed Jones suspected Josiah of having an affair with his daughter-in-law, Donna. Whether true or not, the rumor spread like wildfire. Could a man as powerful and respected as Senator Jones really have ordered such a massacre? Some believed he had hired someone to kill Josiah, with the Moore family and the Stillinger sisters becoming collateral damage. Jones himself denied the allegations, and no evidence ever directly tied him to the crime. But the suspicion lingered, tarnishing his reputation and fueling endless town gossip. The man of God, Reverend George Kelly. Among the strangest and most notorious suspects was Reverend George Kelly, a traveling preacher with a deeply unsettling reputation. Kelly was in Villisca on the night of the murders, attending the same Children's Day program at the Presbyterian Church as the Moore family. Witnesses remembered him as odd, nervous, and overly excitable. Kelly left town early the next morning on a 5:19 a.m. train, just hours after the murders. That fact alone raised eyebrows, but the real suspicions grew later. Kelly was known for bizarre behavior. He was socially awkward, obsessed with religion, and reportedly had a history of peeping into windows. He even wrote strange letters to young women, filled with disturbing sexual undertones. Most chilling of all, Kelly confessed, more than once, to the murders. In 1917, he allegedly told investigators that he had heard a voice commanding him to kill the Moores. But his confessions were inconsistent, filled with contradictions, and many believed he was mentally unstable, more eager for attention than truth. Despite this, Reverend Kelly was eventually put on trial for the murders. The case against him was sensational, capturing national headlines. But after 2 trials, one ending in a hung jury and the other in acquittal, he walked free. To this day, some believe Kelly was guilty, while others think he was simply an eccentric scapegoat. Other shadows of suspicion. The case didn't stop with Jones and Kelly. Over the years, investigators considered dozens of suspects. Henry Andy Sawyer, a transient railroad worker, reportedly became obsessed with the murders, asking others if they thought he could be guilty. He was briefly arrested but later released for lack of evidence. William Mansfield, another drifter, was suspected by Private Detective James Wilkerson, who tied him to multiple axe murders across the Midwest. Some even argued that Mansfield could have been a serial killer. Paul Mueller, a German immigrant suspected in a string of axe murders, was also considered by modern researchers. Though he was never officially linked to Villisca, the brutality and style of the murders matched his known crimes. Each suspect brought new theories, but none brought closure. The deeper the investigation went, the more it felt like trying to catch shadows. The role of the media. As investigators struggled, newspapers turned the case into a national obsession. Headlines across America screamed of the Villisca horror and the Axe murder mystery. Reporters flooded into the town, often printing speculation as fact. The Moore House became a grotesque tourist attraction, with people lining up to peer inside. For Villisca, the attention was a curse. The town was no longer known for its quiet streets or church gatherings. It was forever branded as the site of one of the most brutal murders in American history. And as the media spotlight grew, so did the scandals, rumors, and wild accusations. A community divided. The endless theories and finger-pointing tore at the fabric of Villisca. Neighbors stopped trusting one another. Families divided over whether Frank Jones had blood on his hands. Some whispered that the killer still walked among them, sitting in church pews on Sunday or shopping at the general store. Instead of bringing the town together in grief, the investigation sowed seeds of paranoia and suspicion. Even as funerals passed and the graves of the 8 victims were marked, peace never returned to Villisca. By the end of 1912, the case was already cold. No one had been convicted, and no hard evidence had surfaced. But in the years that followed, each new suspect, each new theory would reopen the wounds and keep the legend of the Villisca Axe Murders alive. Chapter 5. The Trials and False Hopes. By 1913, a year after the Villisca Axe Murders, the town's grief had hardened into a restless hunger for justice. 8 people had been slaughtered in their sleep, including 6 children, and yet not a single person had been held accountable. For a community that prided itself on faith and morality, the absence of answers was unbearable. Pressure grew for the authorities to act, and soon suspects were not only investigated, but also dragged into the spotlight of trials that promised hope and delivered only disappointment. The push for justice. Iowa's law enforcement agencies were overwhelmed from the start. The Villisca murders were unlike anything they had ever encountered. Crime scenes in small towns typically involved robberies, drunken fights, or domestic disputes, not an entire family bludgeoned to death with an axe. As weeks turned into months without progress, people began to accuse the sheriff and investigators of incompetence, even corruption. Rumors swirled that evidence had been mishandled, that political figures interfered, or that detectives were more interested in protecting reputations than finding the killer. Out of desperation, the Moore's relatives and some townsfolk turned to private detectives, hoping outsiders could succeed where officials had failed. That decision would soon plunge the case into years of trials, false confessions, and more broken promises. Private Detective James Wilkerson. One of the most vocal figures to step into the case was James Wilkerson, a private detective with a flair for drama and an eye for headlines. Wilkerson became convinced that the murders were not the work of a random stranger, but part of a larger conspiracy, and he zeroed in on a suspect, William Blackie Mansfield. Mansfield was a drifter with a violent history. Wilkerson argued that Mansfield had committed multiple axe murders across the Midwest, and that Villisca was just one stop in a killing spree. He even tried to link Mansfield to murders in Kansas, Illinois, and Colorado, painting him as a serial killer who killed families with an axe before vanishing into the night. Wilkerson's theory was dramatic and compelling, and many in Villisca wanted to believe it. But there was a problem. Mansfield had airtight alibis for several of the crimes Wilkerson accused him of committing. Though he remained a suspect in some eyes, Mansfield was never formally charged. Wilkerson's relentless pursuit of Mansfield would, however, have unintended consequences. In trying to build his case, he stirred up another powerful figure in Villisca, former Senator Frank Jones. The case against Frank Jones. Wilkerson wasn't content to stop at Mansfield. He publicly accused Senator Frank Jones of conspiring to kill Josiah Moore, motivated by business rivalry and jealousy. According to Wilkerson, Jones had hired Mansfield to carry out the murders. The accusation sent shockwaves through Iowa. Jones was a respected man, a wealthy businessman, and a state senator. To accuse him of orchestrating the slaughter of a family, including children, was unthinkable. But in Villisca, the story made sense to many. The feud between Jones and Moore was common knowledge, and whispers of Moore's alleged affair with Jones's daughter-in-law only fueled suspicion. Despite the scandal, the case against Jones fell apart in court. There was no physical evidence linking him to the crime, no witness testimony strong enough to stand. Jones maintained his innocence until his death, but for the rest of his life, the shadow of Villisca followed him. For the Moore family supporters, it was another devastating dead end. The trials of Reverend George Kelly. Perhaps the most infamous suspect to stand trial was Reverend George Kelly, the eccentric traveling preacher. Kelly was already a suspicious figure, awkward, erratic, and with a documented history of bizarre behavior. But what pushed him into the courtroom were his confessions. In 1917, 5 years after the murders, Kelly confessed to killing the Moores and the Stillinger girls. He claimed that a voice had compelled him to commit the crime, that he had followed divine command. Investigators seized upon his words, believing they finally had their man. But Kelly's confession was riddled with contradictions. At times he gave details that seemed eerily accurate, like the position of the bodies. But at other times, he described events that didn't match the crime scene at all. Critics argued that Kelly was mentally unstable, eager to please interrogators, and possibly coerced into confessing. Nevertheless, Kelly was put on trial in 1917. The proceedings were a media circus, with reporters flocking to Iowa to cover the axe murder preacher. Townsfolk filled the courtroom, some desperate for closure, others simply craving spectacle. The jury deadlocked in the first trial, unable to reach a verdict. In the second trial, Kelly was acquitted. Despite his strange behavior and confessions, the evidence against him was too weak. He walked free, though his reputation never recovered. To many, he remained a chilling figure, the kind of man capable of such violence, even if the courts could not prove it. False hopes and lingering frustrations. Each trial carried with it a wave of hope. Each time a suspect was brought to court, Villisca's citizens thought the nightmare might finally end. But every acquittal, every dismissal, only deepened the wound. Families of the victims were forced to relive their grief over and over again, sitting through testimony, hearing graphic details, only to leave with no justice. The town's divisions grew sharper. Some insisted Frank Jones was guilty. Others swore it had to be Reverend Kelly. Still others clung to the idea of a stranger, someone who had vanished into the night and never looked back. The more time passed, the more the truth seemed to slip away. By the early 1920s, the official investigations had all but stopped. The case went cold, and the Villisca Axe Murders settled into the realm of legend, whispered about in hushed tones, retold in kitchens, schools, and church pews. A town forever haunted. The repeated failures of the justice system left scars that never healed. Villisca was no longer just a town. It was a crime scene, a mystery, a stain that no amount of time could wash away. Residents struggled to rebuild their lives, but the shadow of June 10, 1912, lingered. Children grew up with stories of the axe murders whispered in their ears. Parents warned their kids to lock their doors at night, though deep down, they knew locks hadn't saved the Moores. The murders became part of the town's identity, a ghost that hung over every conversation. And though decades would pass, the ache of unanswered questions endured. Who had truly wielded the axe? Why were the Moores and the Stillinger sisters chosen? Would the truth ever be known, or would Villisca remain forever trapped in the cycle of suspicion and despair? Chapter 6. The Haunting Legacy of Villisca. The Villisca Axe Murders didn't just leave behind 8 graves. They carved a wound into the town itself, a wound that never fully healed. As the years turned into decades, Villisca's identity was no longer tied to its small-town charm or its modest farming roots, but to the bloodstains of June 10, 1912. The house where the Moores and the Stillinger girls took their last breaths became more than a crime scene. It became a symbol of fear, grief, and the supernatural. The house no one wanted. After the murders, the Moore house sat in uneasy silence. Though it was scrubbed and cleaned, though furniture was rearranged and walls repainted, an invisible weight lingered. Families who tried to live there reported strange feelings, sudden cold drafts, footsteps in the empty upstairs hall, doors that creaked open on their own. Neighbors often spoke of a heavy atmosphere surrounding the house, as if the very walls absorbed the horror of that night. At first, These stories were whispered in hushed tones, dismissed as grief or imagination. But as more tenants came and went, each leaving sooner than expected, the whispers grew louder. The Moore house was cursed, people said. It didn't matter who lived there, the darkness remained. The town's divided memory. For Villisca, the murders became both a point of shame and a source of fascination. On one hand, the townspeople wanted to move forward, to put the tragedy behind them and reclaim their peace. On the other, the horror attracted journalists, curiosity seekers, and amateur detectives from across the Midwest. Every few years, someone would publish a new theory about the killer's identity. Some swore it was Reverend Kelly. Others pointed to Mansfield or Jones, or even an unknown drifter. But no matter how many theories circulated, no evidence emerged strong enough to close the case. The older generation wanted silence, to bury the story along with the victims. But the younger ones, raised on ghost stories and legends, leaned into the mystery. To them, the Villisca murders weren't just a tragedy. They were a haunting that defined the town's very soul. Whispers of the supernatural. As the decades passed, the murders became entangled with tales of the supernatural. Children dared one another to walk past the Moore house at night, claiming they saw shadows moving behind the curtains. Visitors reported hearing muffled cries, phantom screams, or the faint sound of an axe striking wood. In the 1960s and 70s, when paranormal investigation began to grow in popularity, ghost hunters turned their attention to Villisca. Some claimed to capture electronic voice phenomena, EVPs, in the house, disembodied voices calling for mama or whispering get out. Others insisted they saw the shapes of children in the upstairs bedrooms, forever trapped in the place where their lives were stolen. Skeptics dismissed these stories as sensationalism, fueled by the town's dark reputation. But even skeptics admitted one thing: standing in the Moore house felt wrong. The air was too heavy, the silence too sharp. Something lingered there, whether ghost or memory, no one could say. The house is a tourist attraction. By the 1990s, the Villisca Axe Murder house had become more than just a local curiosity. It was restored to resemble its 1912 appearance, and soon it was open to the public as a museum. Visitors could tour the rooms, learn the history, and confront the horror firsthand. For some, it was a way of honoring the victims, keeping their memory alive, ensuring their story was never forgotten. For others, it was morbid entertainment, a thrill-seeking opportunity to step into one of America's most infamous crime scenes. The most daring visitors booked overnight stays, sleeping in the same rooms where the murders occurred. Reports from these nights became part of the legend. Lamps flickering on their own, beds shaking, children's laughter echoing in the halls. One paranormal investigator even suffered unexplained injuries, collapsing in the house with a stab wound-like mark in his chest. These accounts only fueled Villisca's reputation as one of the most haunted locations in the United States. The murders were no longer just history. They had become folklore, a blend of true crime and ghost story that blurred the line between fact and fear. The curse of unanswered questions. What makes the Villisca case so haunting isn't just the brutality of the murders, but the lack of closure. Every theory leaves holes. Every suspect leaves doubts. Even after more than a century, no one can say with certainty who held the axe that night. For the families of the victims, this uncertainty was devastating. Generations passed down not justice, but speculation. Descendants of Josiah and Sarah Moore grew up hearing about their relatives' gruesome fate, and with every retelling, the pain remained fresh. The Stillinger family, too, carried the scars. 2 daughters lost forever, their future stolen in a single night. It is this absence of answers that transforms Villisca from a crime scene into a ghost story. The human mind craves resolution, and when it doesn't come, the imagination fills the void, with conspiracies, with spirits, with whispers in the dark. The Axe Murder House today. Today, more than 100 years later, the Moore house still stands at 508 East 2nd Street. Its white frame and modest size look ordinary from the outside, but those who enter know it is anything but ordinary. The rooms feel frozen in time, as if the family who once lived there might return at any moment, though of course, they never will. Tourists still flock to Villisca, drawn by curiosity, by fear, or by a need to pay respect. Some leave convinced they encountered the paranormal. Others leave shaken simply by the weight of history. Few leave untouched. For the people of Villisca, the house is both a burden and a legacy. It ensures their small town will never be forgotten, but it also ties them forever to the night of June 10th, 1912. A legacy of horror. The Villisca Axe murders endure not just because of the brutality, but because they embody a primal fear. The idea that even in the safety of your own home, behind locked doors, danger can find you. The Moores and the Stillinger girls were not careless, nor reckless. They were innocent, asleep in their beds. Yet evil entered anyway. That truth resonates even today, more than a century later. It is why the story continues to be told, why the house still draws visitors, why the memory refuses to fade. Villisca is not just a crime that remains unsolved. It is a reminder that safety is fragile, that the darkness is never far away, and that sometimes the monsters are never caught. As the years passed, the Villisca Axe murders became more than just an unsolved crime. They became a shadow etched into the identity of the town, a whisper that never truly faded. Tourists still wander through the creaking halls of the Moore house, shivering at the thought of what took place there, some claiming to hear faint footsteps or see fleeting figures in the dark. Whether these are the echoes of restless spirits or simply the weight of imagination, no one can say for certain. What remains undeniable is the haunting truth. 8 lives were stolen in a single night, their killer never found, their voices silenced but never forgotten. The Villisca Axe murders remind us that evil doesn't always lurk in faraway places. It can strike in the quietest of towns, behind doors that once seemed safe. And so, the story ends not with answers, but with a lingering question, one that will forever hang over Villisca, Iowa. Who entered that little white house on June 10th, 1912, and why did no one ever pay for the blood left behind?